there's been a roller coaster since we last spoke in trying to make sense of it, because on one side you have good news, everyone's optimistic, a deal is imminent, and then suddenly things, go south. You've got Israel trying to sabotage the deal when it comes to Lebanon. You've got the Trump just now, literally before we started, he said, there will not be lifting of sanctions even if Iran gives up their enriched uranium, which we've all been under the understanding that if Iran gives up the uranium, the US would lift the sanctions. And now they're disagreeing on whether assets should be unfrozen or not. Iran wants $24 billion unfrozen, some 12 billion now, 12 billion in 60 days. And we'll see what the US responds with. But it does seem like there are some concessions on the American side. They're not talking about the Strait of Hormuz fee anymore. It seems they're going to rebrand it to something that legally makes sense. So Iran got that. They're not talking about the proxies or the allies, the axis of resistance. They're not talking about the ballistic missile program. That's out of the question now. And the last thing that seems to remain on the table are two things: the unfreezing of assets and Israel and Lebanon. Are you more optimistic than we last spoke? Are you skeptical of these developments? Where do you stand now?
I think much depends on the guidance that President Trump receives from Mr. Netanyahu. I think President Trump is not really president of the United States. I think he's ultimately obeying the orders that are given to him by Mr. Netanyahu and his government. I think that's one of the reasons you've seen so much vacillation. Now, some of the vacillation is a function of Donald Trump's efforts to manipulate the marketplace. That's obvious. But in terms of meaningful agreements, we have none yet, nor are we likely to see anything in the meantime, as long as the Israelis exercise veto power. And Netanyahu has veto power over everything and anything that President Trump does. Now, the question is, could that change? I don't know. I would hope so. But thus far, I think that's pretty clear. And you've already hit the nail on the head. The Israelis have tended to treat our ongoing hostilities with Iran as something they can exploit to busy themselves elsewhere. Finish the job in southern Lebanon, finish the job in Gaza in pursuit of the Greater Israel Project. But that doesn't mean that they're going to sign on for peace with Iran, because they want something that we have not been able to deliver, and that is the destruction of Iran. All you have to do is go back and look at the various goals that we set for ourselves. We started off with this ridiculous notion that there were millions of people in Iran that wanted to dispose of their own government. They sent in the CIA and the Mossad and probably MI6 to try and stir this up. It failed. The government remained strong. And so then what was the new goal? Well, it's decapitation. We just have to go in and kill all the leaders. And like most states in the Middle East, Iran will fall apart. Iran is not like most states in the Middle East. Iran is a civilizational state. It's existed for 2,000 plus years. Bombing them isn't going to make much difference in the grand scheme of things. But we didn't see it that way. We grossly underestimated them, overestimated ourselves. And that's because we tend to project our feelings and thinking and values on others. And we say frequently in the Pentagon and Washington, well, we wouldn't put up with this. This is something we would never tolerate. And we forget that the rest of the world thinks differently from us. So that failed. The decapitation has failed. The first several weeks of intensive bombing have failed. So now we still are at a kind of pause. It's not a complete pause because we still have violence. We still have exchanges of gunfire and so forth. The question is, what comes next? And the only thing left for us is the destruction of the Iranian state and its society. And that's what I always thought it would come down to, because that's really what Israel demands. Israel's strategic position has not really improved over the last several years. It's gotten much worse. They've created more enemies than they ever had in the past. Iran is not the only capable state out there that can present real resistance to them. But they're afraid that if they don't make an example of Iran, everything in the region that they've tried to create for themselves will be at risk and probably won't survive. So you've got to destroy Iran. I don't think President Trump personally is interested in that, but I'm not sure he really cares. I think he's beginning to care more, but for reasons that don't have much to do with Iran, that have a lot more to do with us. And we can talk about that.
I just remembered, by the way, our first conversation ever in Washington when we talking. I mentioned to you, it seems Hezbollah's been, completely decapitated. The capabilities have been eroded, and now we're seeing Hezbollah use drone warfare to cause significant casualties to Israel. And there's a lot of reports on the Israeli front. The military spread very thin. They couldn't achieve their objectives in Iran. Iran is coming out of this stronger. They control the Strait of Hormuz. They're more emboldened. They seem more determined to support their allies or their proxies. And then you've got Hamas is still there, and Hezbollah is using drone warfare, and it seems to be working well for them. So,
and Mario, and as I recall, when you asked me the question about Hezbollah, I said absolutely not. Hezbollah is not.
You did.
And you looked at me as though I owed you money.
Yeah, you remember that? Yeah, I was very surprised. I didn't expect that from you. I mentioned it as like a fact because we saw those pager attacks, and then Nasrallah was killed. I treated it as fact. And that was, I had someone from the IDF from Project 8200, and he said something similar to what you said. He's like, Mario, Israel is great tactically, and they're great at killing people, but strategically, that's where they fail. That's someone who was formerly in Project 8200 in the IDF. And that's similar to what you just said now. Strategically, Israel is in a very bad spot. And I think it's hard to deny that.
Well, I think there's a lot of evidence that the Israeli Defense Force, at least the ground portion, is effectively imploding. And I think the chief of the Israeli Defense Force has tried to make it clear that they can't continue on the current path. You've got a problem with calling up reservists who won't come, who won't show up. You've got problems with reservists leaving. And you have, I think, also a broader deterioration of discipline. When, we already saw lots of things happen in Gaza, which indicated poor discipline. Now we're seeing some of this in South Lebanon with Israeli soldiers that are looting homes that have been attacked and destroyed in southern Lebanon. When that begins to happen, your army is falling apart. So I think the Israeli army on the ground is in bad shape. I can't speak about the Air Force. The Air Force has always been the principal instrument of aggressive military power for the Israelis, and their pilots are excellent. And I think they have an inexhaustible quantity of spare parts and aircraft. So I'm sure they're in pretty good shape, but you can lose the war quickly regardless of how good your Air Force is if you don't have an army.
Yeah. I've been getting the sense that the influence Netanyahu has over Trump has been diminishing after this Iran war. And I've said it a few times where I think he bit off more than he could chew. We've seen reports today and yesterday and even the day before where Israel announced this new campaign that included the bombing of Beirut. Then Netanyahu had a call with Trump, and then nothing happened. They're still bombing the south. They did escalate, but nothing happened in Beirut. And then when you look at the deal in Iran, it's a deal that is catastrophic for Israel and the balance of power in the region. Is it possible that maybe, just maybe, we are starting to see a shift in Trump's approach or the U.S. administration's approach towards Israel, or that's wishful thinking?
Well, let's look at the things that may be influencing President Trump at this point and step away for a minute from the Persian Gulf. The Persian Gulf is an insoluble problem. Let's be frank. Over the last 80 years, we ran into a brick wall, if you will, in Korea. We couldn't make any headway. We couldn't win it. There was no interest in fighting China, thank God. And Eisenhower made the prudent and intelligent decision to leave. He said, no, we're going to negotiate an armistice and we're not going to continue this war. And that's what happened. But we failed in Korea. I think that's very important for people to understand. That was not a victory. And we made the best of a defeat that we could possibly make strategically. Then you go to Vietnam. Vietnam, there was no strategy, just as there is no real strategy now. People that went in there never knew what the hell they were supposed to be doing. They had various vague notions. It was unclear. And what was it? 6 years later, we decided, well, this isn't working. And we began the process of disengaging. And as soon as we got out, everyone agreed we'll never do this again. Well, that didn't turn out to be accurate. But then you had 1991. And 91 was a very different set of circumstances. That was an enemy that was perfectly configured, trained, equipped, and positioned for us to defeat. They met us on our terms. We hit them back on our terms, and we won. And this tremendous victory that very few people at the time thought was possible for reasons I never understood. We then concluded, well, there's no one in the world that can touch us. We are supreme. The Soviet state has collapsed. Everyone else has given up and stacked arms. So it's time to, leverage this strategic power. And we began leveraging it as soon as possible. Not long thereafter, we resumed hostilities with Saddam Hussein when, frankly, there was no reason to do so. Saddam Hussein presented no threat. And quite frankly, Saddam Hussein was always willing to do business with us. He'd have sold us all the oil we want. He'd have cooperated in anything we wanted to do. But it was decided that the path to Israeli dominance was through Baghdad. In fact, Paul Wolfowitz said something along those lines. If you want the path to peace in the Middle East, the path to Jerusalem runs through Baghdad. Well, that made no sense, but everybody bought it, and the rest is history. Then we went into Afghanistan, as you know, and we muddled around there, not knowing what we could do, and that didn't go very well. Eventually, we just up and left in one of the most embarrassing, ignominious withdrawals of American military power in the history of the United States. But to date, those things didn't matter to the American people. And that's very important for people to understand. We didn't care. The average American didn't care because it didn't affect him. That's changing. Iran is different. Iran cannot be conquered. That was a phrase that the Bolsheviks used to the Germans in 1918 during the Brest-Litovsk negotiations. And actually, one of them, named Radek, wrote back to Lenin, "The good news is the Germans understand we cannot be conquered." Well, how could they conquer them? They were 1,000 miles away, and it was an 1,100, 1,200 mile front. Anybody be crazy to go in there, as was demonstrated by Adolf Hitler. But at the time, he was very, very much on the right side of the argument. The Germans understood that. The Iranians know we cannot conquer Iran. There will be no draft. We are not going to bring millions of men into the armed forces. We're not going to build means of transporting them halfway around the world. We're not going to nationalize industry and mobilize it. That's not going to happen. So Iran cannot be conquered. So what do? Well, this is a big problem for Donald Trump because he promised all sorts of things. He governs by tweet. That's the problem. There are no speeches that you can point to that outline any real policies. Instead, you have to read through tweets. And it's best if you are a schizophrenic, because then you can follow the tweets. Because if you have a normal mind, you can't possibly understand what the man is talking about. So you've been following him this day, this night, and what do you come up with? Well, at the end of the day, what's changed? Nothing. What's meaningful? Nothing. And the only thing that he continues to insist is that everyone must bow to Israel's demands. And the demands that we are trying to impose on Iran are not our demands. They're Israel's demands. The United States Armed Forces has paused to attack Iran, not because of anything Iran did to us, but because Israel is demanding it. So we are the servants of Greater Israel. We need to understand that. There shouldn't be any question in anybody's mind. If you want to know who governs, it's not Donald Trump. It's Netanyahu. Donald Trump is simply passing on the message. However, we have problems. If you go back to April, you discover that inflation rose from 3.2% to 3.8%. And right now, the projections are for the second quarter that it will rise to 6%. Oof. Now, if it rises to 6%, this means that our interest rates, theoretically, if you're Paul Volcker and you're serious about suppressing inflation as he was back in the 70s and 80s under Reagan, that means your interest rates should be about 7%. But they're not. They're right about 3.75%. Well, why is that? Because if we were actually to raise rates to 7, we'd crush the economy.
Yeah.
We'd destroy everything. This is what confronts Donald Trump at home. So what's Donald Trump been doing? Well, he recognizes the war is a huge source of inflation. because he cut out, 13 million barrels of oil a day by doing what he's done in the Persian Gulf. Well, how's he work? What's he doing about it? Well, he's trying to compensate. So he has started to sell oil from our strategic petroleum reserve in order to suppress the cost, keep the cost down. Not only domestically in the United States. In fact, last week I was told that he had sold 17.8 million barrels from the strategic petroleum reserve at a price below market rates. This was sufficient to suppress oil prices to $110 a barrel. The problem is he's also selling oil below market rates to some of our friends in Asia as a way to try and compensate for the stupidity of having never asked any of our friends in Asia, like Japan and Korea and others, what they thought of our dumb idea of attacking Iran. Okay. So what does this mean? Well, this means that probably by the end of July, maybe the beginning of August, we're going to be hitting rock bottom in the Strategic Petroleum Reserve. Now, is that the end of the world for us? Not necessarily, but it may be the end of Donald Trump. And that's what people don't seem to understand. He didn't understand when he went to China that China is 86% self-sufficient in oil. They've stockpiled oil. They have the largest petroleum reserve in the world, 1.3 billion barrels. Okay, so now we have another problem. And that problem is Russia. Russia has proven very helpful to China and other countries by selling oil. But in the meantime, we stupidly have been encouraging and helping the Ukrainians with targeting data and intelligence to attack targets inside Russia with long-range drones whose components are made in Western Europe. And these drones have done what? They've attacked refineries. So right now, Russia has got a problem. It can't keep up with the demand anymore. Well, what is this doing to us? Well, this is hurting Europe. It's hurting us. It's hurting the world. So we think, what is it? We're not really sure. We think there's a 14% shortfall now that wasn't there before. In other words, here we are struggling with the oil or the energy supply. And when I say energy, that's everything. Just remember, it includes sulfuric acid, helium, fertilizer, feedstock, all kinds of fuel, jet fuel, whatever. All of those things are in short supply. And he knows that, and he's trying to fix it, but he can't control what his own government is doing in Europe. Because the smartest thing we could possibly do right now is stop the war in Ukraine, end it, pull out completely, get out totally. That is the easiest way to restore some measure of normality to the economies in Europe. Because right now, the economies in Europe are suffering from deindustrialization. Well, that's about to end. You're going to get a new government in Berlin. You're going to have a new government in London. When those new governments come in, and I'm not sure exactly what the personality makeup will be. I think Aliza Vital has a good chance of becoming chancellor. But she speaks for many when she says the first thing we're going to do is halt this war with Ukraine. We're not going to waste any more money on these criminals and thugs in Ukraine. Number two, we're going to go to Russia and buy cheap oil. In other words, we've got to get back to cheap energy that we can afford. All of this is going to happen as soon as the war ends. But instead of ending the war, and he is, after all, still the head of NATO. He's the key person in NATO. And what's he do? Nothing. He lets it drag on. He lets the intelligence services run wild, run amok, and do whatever they like. I mean, that's one of the reasons that Putin said many, many times, I've met with many presidents, they always end up being unable to change anything. They don't seem to be in charge. And I think that's clearly the attitude today in Moscow. Trump is obviously not in charge. So what are we looking at? I think what Trump is being told privately is that the global economy is probably going to shrink over the next 12 months by 36%. 36%. Now, why is that important? Because the Great Depression reduced the world economy by 20%. Now, what's the difference between 20% and 36% today? Well, it's not just the percentage, it's also the fact that we are heavily in debt. We had practically no debt to GDP ratio at all in the 1930s. And we demanded from our allies in the First World War that they pay us not in cash, but in gold. And so we had vast quantities of gold pouring into the United States. My point is, what do we got now? We have a much higher debt to GDP ratio. It's at least 125%. Some people think it's really 130 and rising. Trump knows this. So if you're the president of the United States and you know you're in a very bad position economically, what do? You try to get out. He wants to get out. The problem is he's got Netanyahu and Netanyahu's billionaire agents inside the United States to say, no, you can't leave. If you leave, we pull our support for you. It's open season on you. We won't protect you anymore. You've had it, Donald. And by the way, Congress is going to jump at the opportunity to destroy Donald Trump, whether they're Republicans or Democrats, and he knows that. So what can he do? He has a choice. He can ride the Titanic to the bottom. He's already on the Titanic. It's already struck the iceberg. He can go down with it. Or he can try to get off, which means he has to jump in that ice cold water. He's going to have to subject himself to humiliation. He may ultimately be revealed as being very prominent in the Epstein files.
Well, he's speaking just now while we're speaking. Iran is very much intent. They want very much to make a deal. So I know you said just ignore his comments. We don't have much to go by these days. So everyone's just waiting for his comments, which are all over the place. He says Iran wants to make a deal. So far, they haven't gotten there. We're not satisfied with it, but we will be either that or we'll have to just finish the job. They're negotiating on fumes. Maybe we'll just have to go back and finish it. Maybe we don't. Very different rhetoric to what we had on Sunday. And this is how I see it as well. As like he wants a deal. He wants to get out of this mess. But there's all these different powers, there's donors, different countries, Israel, his administration, pulling him in all these different directions, including the Gulf. The Gulf are pulling him towards peace, but all the other forces are pulling him in different directions, not necessarily towards peace or trying to sabotage the deal. So it's like you have a Trump, I think you have an honest tweet from Trump saying, look, we're going to do a deal with Iran. It's going to happen. And maybe they'll join the Abraham's Accords. Obviously, that's just rhetoric. But no threats, nothing. That was, I think, on Sunday. He did a tweet, no threats, no humiliation, nothing. And then 2 days later, he's talking about maybe we have to finish the job. The deal's not there yet. And then he doubles down on the Abraham's Accords. That's just a bizarre thing to happen. For me, it just seemed like he's giving Netanyahu a bone because he didn't allow him to bomb Beirut.
Well, he may be offering him a bone, but what he's doing is he's embarrassing himself in a very, very dramatic way. What is he telling everyone? Look, guys, I have to deliver a victory for Netanyahu, for Israel.
Yeah.
Help me deliver a victory for Israel. Why would anyone in the Middle East, any ruling elite of any kind, want to do a damn thing for Israel? Israel has already said everyone in the region except for them is Amalek. They've declared themselves, superior to everyone. They're waging a war for Jewish supremacy in the Middle East. That's what they're about. We are helping them. They couldn't murder people in Gaza. They can't kill people in South Lebanon without us. We are the enablers of all of that. So the question comes back once again to Donald Trump. Are you president of the United States or what? President Trump, what is in the interest of the American people? Well, if he asks that and answers it honestly, we have an interest in peace. Do we want to be the pariah in the world? Because when you travel around the world these days, whether it's in Europe or you go to Canada or even down into Latin America or across Asia and Africa, who is held responsible for what's happened in the Persian Gulf? Iran? No, we are. So if you're the president of the United States, you want to correct that mistake as quickly as possible and end this tragedy. So where's the debate? That's number one. Number two, he needs to think about what's going on at home in the United States. The potential here for unrest, given what the things that I cited to you in the economy, where things are headed, is very serious. Lenin said, and it's probably hyperbolic, but he said it nonetheless, every society is 3 meals away from a revolution. Well, he wasn't completely wrong. We have not yet felt the effects of what's been happening in the Persian Gulf on the scale that we will. In other words, there's a lag time between what happens now and the real effects in several months. And my
Can he
point,
turn things around? Can he, if he ends this quickly, could he turn things around before it's too late still?
it's going to be tough. It's going to be very hard. I think he's going to have a tough time doing it. But at this point, it's no longer about him. It's about the American people. It's about the fragility of our economy, the vulnerability of the financial system. He's got to focus here on those things, because if he doesn't, it's ultimately going to bring him down. He's not going to be voted out of office because he failed to destroy Iran, because he failed to capture the Strait of Hormuz. That's not going to get him. But what I told you earlier about inflation, about the economy, productivity falling by 20, 30, 36%, that could kill him. That could kill the government. And it's worse than that. Nobody seems to understand. If you go back to the end of World War I, certainly from 1917 until the war ends, that's about 15 months from the middle of 1917. The Ottomans, the Romanovs, the Hohenzollerns, the Habsburgs, they had all collectively ruled for somewhere between 300 and 800 years. And they ceased to exist overnight. That could happen in Western Europe. It could happen here in the United States. People don't realize that. We take too much for granted. When your supply chains break down, when there is no credit, and right now when you have large firms like BlackRock or KKR trying to borrow cash based on their assets under management, you're in trouble. Right now, if you have money in BlackRock's funds, you can't get it out. Why not? How long before the liquidity problem strikes us in the major banking system? There are a lot of things that are out of sight, but they're not that far away. There's lots of potential for disaster. The problem, Mario, is that most Americans have experienced 80 years of extraordinary stability. And it's incomprehensible to them that this could all end in a few months. But it could. And that's back to the original question. What matters most if you're Donald Trump? What happens in the United States? And what happens globally, financially, and economically? Those things are the top priorities, not the Strait of Hormuz, not destroying Iran, not enabling Israel's conquest of the Middle East, the creation of the Greater Israel Project.
Yeah. And the consequences of this war are insane. Actually, we haven't spoken in a while. It's been a few weeks. It's wild to see that unfold. Like, we talk about how we've talked for a long time about the American empire kind of, moving to a multipolar world, etc. You've been critical of the capabilities of the American military. And then you look at these things starting to unfold. The fact I saw a report today, and there's been many similar reports. There's one today. There it is. Don't know what the source is, but every major underground missile base in Iraq is now back in operation, either fully or partially. About 80% of all tunnel entrances that were collapsed during the war have been restored as of this moment. Some minor clearing needs to happen in heavy hit places like Tabriz and a couple of others. That's from Western media. And we've seen reports like this come time and time again. This is after a 6-week bombing campaign where we're told the Navy's completely destroyed. Then we see boats were attacked 2 days ago. Why are their boats being attacked if the Navy's gone? Iran scrambled jets a few days ago, and they closed their airspace last weekend when strikes seemed imminent. So that's from a military perspective. And then you see China, the trip by Trump to China. He comes back, and instead of having some new breakthrough on Iran, he's talking about maybe freezing the weapons delivery to Japan, delaying that to Taiwan. And also the Japanese weapons delivery has been delayed. Europe has obviously been delayed. It's like, we talk about these things for a while, but then when they unfold, it still surprises. It's still hard to see and understand.
Well, let's give President Trump some credit. He came back enlightened from his trip to China. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, listen to his comments. He said, this business of a war with Taiwan is not something we want to be involved with. Taiwan is 100 miles off the coast of China. If we fight over there, we have to travel 6,000 or 7,000 miles to get there. Congratulations, Donald Trump. You learned that lesson in the Persian Gulf. You've gone to the Iranian School of Military Education. The Iranians have taught us that. That's wonderful. Thank God. Let's put this nonsense about war with China aside. Forget it. Somebody once said to me, well, Doug, you don't want to go to war with China. So if the Chinese go to war with us, where do you plan to meet them? And I said, where we can win. And they said, well, where's that? I said, how about the middle of the Pacific Ocean? Because that we could win. That's what our fleet can do very, very well. The problem, Americans don't completely grasp this. They never have. But they have to, because we have no strategy. If you have no strategy, anything's possible. If you have a strategy, then things become difficult. And a lot of things are not attainable because you have a strategy. You recognize that's not strategically attainable. And no armed force can do anything. In other words, or everything. Right now we have dropped great tonnage of explosives on top of the Iranians. But it has no effect because you don't exploit it on the ground. Strikes only create temporary paralysis. It is during that state of temporary paralysis when the ground force sweeps in, destroys what's left, consolidates the victory, and establishes a new status quo. Well, we can't do that. We'd have no army. I'm sorry, but when you only have 450,000 men by the standards of history, that's not an army. That's a gesture. Who are we kidding? Russians have an army. They have over 1 million men now under arms in the Russian army. That's a real army. We don't have a real army. Now, I'm not saying that we should go out and try to recruit 1 million people into the United States Army, but we have to recognize what's real and what isn't, what's possible and what isn't. So we can exploit whatever strategic advantage we achieve with the strikes. So this is not Iraq. We can't simply rush across the border with a few hundred tanks and aircraft and march straight into Baghdad. It's impossible. Can't be done. So you're not going to pull that off. Nobody explained that to Donald Trump. He doesn't understand it because he has no background in it. And sadly, none of the military people really made it abundantly clear to him because we've bred generations of yes men at the top of the American military establishment. So keep those things in mind. At least he's figured it out with China. And I think he now understands he can't do to Iran what he wanted to do. So he is looking for a way out, but it has to be something that avoids personal humiliation for him in his mind.
My worry on Taiwan is the reasons he said it. It seems he's, instead of walking away from Taiwan because strategically it doesn't make sense and doing it right, he's throwing Taiwan under the bus at a time when he already looks very weak and just for the wrong reasons because the munitions are depleted, etc. So for me, it's like he took the right step for the wrong reasons.
I don't agree with that. Of course, I don't see China, mainland China, as the evil empire. In fact, if given the opportunity, the people on Taiwan will vote themselves back into China. That's where it'll go. If you take time to try and understand the Chinese, and that's not easy, and I don't claim to be a Chinese expert, but people in China and people in Taiwan both share the same ultimate goal. They all want to live in Singapore. Now, what does that mean? It means exactly what I said. They are willing to live in an environment that is far more restrictive and by our standards more oppressive than anything in the West. But they're willing to do that because their preeminent goal is what? Prosperity, security, order. These are the things that are most important to the Chinese. So if we step away from this Taiwan craziness, the idea that we should go to war on the basis of this island's independence from China, I think we're going to see it all work out very, very well. And we have to stop thinking that the rest of the world all wants to live like us. It doesn't. It just doesn't.
No, I agree with that. What I'm saying is that the Taiwan thing fits into a broader problem, which is the U.S. military is in a really bad shape. We saw the munition stockpiles, weapons delivery has been delayed, not only Taiwan, but Japan and Europe as well. And you're talking about how the emergency reserves of oil as well have been depleted. It's like we're borrowing from the future, and we have been for a long time, and now we're accelerating that. And that is very worrying. I just learned about the Dark Eagle. That was a while ago, but the Dark Eagle hypersonic missile. So I started researching where is the US at on the hypersonic missile capabilities perspective. It costs them like 10 times more than China, 4 or 5 times more than Russia, and manufacturing capability significantly less than those countries. Then you look at the drone interception capabilities. It's not there at all, despite them being able to learn from Ukraine and replicate what Ukraine and Russia are doing. They haven't done that. So it's like, I understand that we are moving into a multipolar world, but I worry it's accelerating, and I just worry it could we fall into the Thucydides trap, and it wouldn't be pretty.
Well, Mario, I wrote a book called Breaking the Phalanx. It was published in January 1997. I wrote it in 96. It was one of these books that at the time stirred up a great deal of interest. The first people to translate it out of English into another language were the Chinese. And the Chinese adopted a great deal of what I put into Breaking the Phalanx. It then became popular in other areas. However, inside the United States, it was not very popular. Certainly not with the Army, not with any of the armed forces. Now, there was a chapter where I tried to discuss what I thought could happen in the future. And I was talking about a war that would happen, say, in 20 years. This is 1997 when it came out. And it talked about naval forces, a fleet offshore from the Persian Gulf in the Indian Ocean. And I talked about men in pickup trucks with cruise missiles on the back of the launchers, parking the pickup truck, getting out of the pickup truck, disappearing, and then people inland, miles away from the rocket launcher, essentially launching the missiles and then guiding these missiles into ships. And they were trying at the time to attack a large aircraft carrier. And the person who was guiding this, in other words, steering the missile, mistook a Marine amphibious carrier for one of the big carriers. So they succeeded in sinking the Marine amphibious carrier. Well, you cannot imagine how many people were angry about that, particularly in the Navy and the Marines. Oh, you're wrong. You can't do that. That's out of the question. I talked about what we had experienced in 1991, the things that nobody ever talked about, but we experienced. One of them was we tried to look at an amphibious landing that we could execute in southern Iraq, and we struck mines with our destroyers. And any notion of an amphibious landing was immediately off the table. Forget it. There are mines out there. Well, there may have only been 10 mines or 15 mines. It didn't matter. There could be 500 mines. The fact is, there's a mine there. We're not going to go do that. So then the question is, well, if amphibious forces are this easy to defeat, whether you're using cruise missiles or you're using sea mines, why are we wasting so much money on them? Well, that's where we are. We have been wasting huge quantities of money building more exquisite versions of what we had during the Second World War. And that's what everybody likes. And everybody on the Hill likes it because that sends the money to the usual destinations in their states. So that if you're in Texas, what are you interested in building? Well, you want F-35s, you want helicopters. If you live in, say, North Carolina or Washington State, you're probably interested in something else. Do you understand what I'm saying?
Yeah.
The point is that nothing of substance really changes. And then, of course, you tell yourself repeatedly for 80 years, we're the best. There's nobody better than us. Or don't be ridiculous. I spoke at the Army War College, and I talked about other armies, and one of these Army officers was very offended by me. So I'm a lieutenant colonel. I command a battalion. I've seen these other armies. They're nothing compared to us. And at the time, I was trying to tell him that the Russian military was not a paper tiger. I was trying to tell him about different standards of discipline, different ways of doing business, different tactics, different technologies. We are very full of ourselves. We are now paying a terrible price for it. And it's back to projecting onto others what we think is appropriate or inappropriate, right or wrong, instead of looking objectively at what's happening. And that's why, for a fraction of the amount of money that we've spent with the use of satellites and downlinks to hundreds of platforms that fire missiles at unmanned systems, Iran has denied us access not only to their country, but to the Persian Gulf. And unless we're willing to knock down satellite arrays, unless we're willing to go in and systematically find, once we've knocked down the target arrays where all these things are located, we're not going to win. So what do? We leave. But you can't just leave. And I remember being told that so many times by so many people. When we went into Iraq in 2003, there was no plan to occupy that place. We didn't want to occupy it. Dr. Wolfowitz and his gang wanted us to occupy it. And he recruited Cheney, and they went in to see not Donald Trump at the time, but President Bush. Said, let's occupy it. You know what they said? They said, Mr. President, we have an opportunity in Iraq that was greater than anything we thought. Iraq was far weaker than we anticipated. We can build the first Arab liberal democracy in the world from the ground up, and it will be friendly to Israel. So we've been smoking crack cocaine on a routine basis in Washington everywhere. This is the ultimate outcome. This is the penultimate demonstration of our stupidity, our ignorance, our arrogance. We're at the end of this process. I don't know what comes next, but I do think that everyone should look very, very carefully at what happens inside the United States, what happens inside France, inside Germany, inside Great Britain, and other countries. I think we are on the verge of unrest on the scale of the 1848 revolutions. The difference is that the regimes that were challenged in 1848 were still strong, and they were still viewed as legitimate. Increasingly, the people in Europe and here in the United States no longer view the institutions of national governance as legitimate. How many times do you hear an American say these days, it doesn't matter who you vote for, you get the same outcome over and over and over again? That is a very, very dangerous observation. Now, take away food, take away fuel, take away jobs. What do you get? 10% of the American population spends 90% of the money inside the economy.
Yeah, the inequality is crazy.
That's what you call a recipe for revolution.
Yeah. Ray Dalio's been warning a lot about this. It's like my next question is, how will the Gulf look like? And what you're saying is, Mari, that's not where you should focus. This has gone beyond the Gulf now. And this is going to hurt the American consumer or the American system that we've all depended on. And like the what he said, like people talking about, doesn't matter who you vote for, you'll get the same policies. I remember I had a guest 2 days ago who was Trump's lawyer, who's now very critical of Trump after the Epstein files and the Iran war. His name is, he told me, he was going through how every year since he was born, the U.S. has been, Robert Barnes, the U.S. has been in a war. And, it gets you thinking. It's like, why? It doesn't matter who you vote for. And Trump was like the epitome of someone that's going to end wars. He's promising to end the Russia-Ukraine war in 24 hours. We all knew his political, him gaining political points. But who would have imagined, Colonel, that we'll end up stuck in Iran? Like, I'm sure you warned of it, but like to this extent?
Yeah, well, never underestimate the stupidity of your political leaders and your senior military officers. I mean, you got to be frank about that. I mean, I knew this wasn't going to work, but I do admit that I think it's gone on longer than I thought it would. I would have thought that more sober minds would have prevailed earlier and reached some sort of face-saving agreement and beat feet out of the area. I would urge everyone to think in the following terms. There was a revolution in Russia. The first revolution in Russia brought a man named Kerensky to power. Kerensky was a social democrat. And Kerensky had an opportunity to lead Russia out of the war and in new directions. He wasn't interested in killing the Tsar. He was not interested in destroying the institutions that had governed Russia for hundreds of years. But he was tempted by the Allies to stay into the war with promises of lots of gold and support and assistance. And 8 months after he took over, he was replaced by someone else who promised to end the war. And that man was Lenin. And Lenin ended the war. Mm-hmm. My advice to everybody involved in this travesty in Washington is end the war now. Don't tempt fate. We are not as concrete in our character as everyone thinks. Our society is more fragile than everyone thinks. Our civilization is more fragile. This business of destroying other people's countries, that's sheer insanity. We need all the civilization we can get on this planet right now. The last thing we should be interested in doing is destroying anyone's civilization, most of all our own. And that is arguably what's happening. And it's not yet noticeable, but it's going to become much more noticeable in the months ahead.
From a geopolitical standpoint, how do you think the rest of the world is going to react to this war? Because I think this war, despite it being short and significantly less casualties than previous wars, just the damage it has done to the global economy, as you've been explaining, but also just the image of American security, you know, what the Gulf had to go through, what Asia had to go through, what Europe had to go through. Could we see a big pivot around the world, including the Gulf, away from that dependence on the US?
I think this is already well underway. It's abundantly clear that China, once again, is essentially the engine of prosperity for the world. Now, what do I mean by that? If you go back over the last 5,000 years of history, certainly for the last 2,000, with the exception of, I would argue, the last 300 plus years, the wealth produced in China was the greatest concentration of wealth on the planet. 1492 changed that. Suddenly, there was another source of wealth. It was in the so-called New World, in the Western Hemisphere, in inexhaustible quantities of gold and silver, new crops, potatoes, corn. Suddenly, Europe's focus, Africa's focus, everything went west, away from China and India, and away ultimately from the Ottomans. That's over now. The shift is moving in the other direction because the great concentration of wealth and technology and so forth is no longer in the West, it's in China. And so you're seeing the world move almost like, magnetized minerals towards the great magnet, China. And people are upset by this in the United States, but there's good news. China is historically not a martial country. China historically does not invade other people's countries. In fact, the last time they tried something, it was in Vietnam. It ended very badly for them. The Chinese are not inclined in that direction. The Chinese already see themselves as living at the center of the world and world civilization. Why would they want to go anywhere else? So that's not all bad. And there's an opportunity for us, instead of seeing this as a great threat, to learn from this and to change course, to chart a new course into the future. That doesn't have to be hostility to China or to anyone. That's the great advantage that we always had. We were always this society that was blessed because it sat between two oceans, and it could not be dragged into everybody else's wars and misfortunes. And as long as we lived that way, we were very successful and very prosperous. But we discovered that we could influence the outcome of wars in ways that benefited us financially and economically. And we thought that that was an invitation to garrison the world and shape it to our satisfaction. It's turned into a nightmare. We need to get out. Just as the British needed to get out of India, we need to get out of all these places where we currently have forces. It's time for us to move in new directions.
Yeah.
President Trump can do that, but I don't see him doing it. I think we're going to end up being thrown out of Korea, out of Japan, out of Germany, out of Italy, about everywhere on the Eurasian continent. I don't see any evidence that we are going to put forces back into the Persian Gulf.
As a final question, I always like to ask you that, to speculate based on the information we have now, beyond the economic impact this could have on the US, what do you expect to happen in the Persian Gulf, which we've kind of talked about, but also in Russia, Ukraine? And we've got Cuba as well. Do we expect a Venezuela-like operation in Cuba? Yeah, here we are. And Russia, Ukraine, is there any hope there that Trump could end that?
I think what we're going to do is eventually we're just going to leave the Persian Gulf. That's what we're going to do. We're certainly not going to pay reparations to anyone. We don't have the financial strength to rebuild everything. If you're sitting in the United Arab Emirates, Qatar, Bahrain, or I guess I should say Qatar, or Saudi Arabia, the people with the wherewithal, the financial wherewithal to rebuild things are sitting in Beijing. They're not in New York City or Washington or London. So I think that's the direction things are going to go there. It's a natural outcome of this stupid war. We essentially waged war against ourselves, all on behalf of Israel. The question is, can we finally divest ourselves of this Israeli problem that infects our government, that causes us to do stupid things that are antithetical to our national interest? That's another internal question.
Yeah, true. Okay. Colonel, good to see you again. Thank you for jumping on 2 days in a row. We did yesterday and today.
Okay. Good to see you, Mario. It's better when we part and you're not angry with me. I'm very happy.
Thank you so much, Colonel.
Bye-bye.